importance. For the next talk, I would like to invite Dr. Opher Kornfeld from Spark NS, which, if you remember, Damian Osratkar mentioned in his slides, to give a talk on addressing the academia industry gap to advance discoveries to the clinic. The floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. First of all, I'll say thank you for the invitation, although Shpela reminded me this morning that I actually invited myself to this conference. But nevertheless, thank you for having me. I'm actually going to start with the end and with my acknowledgments. Um, I am a scientist. I'm an impatient scientist. I spend a lot of my days talking to other scientists, and I tend to bring my urgency to the table because I remind the scientists that I work with that it is not our time as scientists, it's patient times, it's family times. And so I'm usually the one in the room that brings urgency to the table. And it's not since I met Spella and her team that I was really taught what urgency actually means. And so thank you for teaching us urgency. And again, thank you for having me today. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of our organization, why we exist, how we get involved. And it starts with this picture. Now, when I talk to other scientists, to other drug developers, this picture is usually something that we see a lot. Perhaps you may have seen something like this before. You've heard this morning vignettes about different components of this process, but this is a very simplistic version of what drug development looks like, going all the way from an idea ultimately to a drug. You heard a little bit about the phases that are happening in green earlier this morning, and you learned about the phases here in purple, the work that was done in animal studies as we were gaining more and more confidence prior to going to patients, which is finally shown here in blue. Now, although this diagram is shown really nicely, neatly, linearly, turns out drug development is far from being this simple and this linear. It actually kind of looks like this. And the text here is too small. I don't want you to read it. I'll tell you a little secret. I did my PhD in metabolism, so I used to study diagrams that look this complicated. I worked really hard to never study them again. But even though we can't read the text here, I want to point out some observations that we can make simply from this figure about drug development. First, you can tell it's not very linear. The second one is that evidence, scientific evidence, is key at every single step of the process, and you've gotten an appreciation for that this morning. This is usually a note that I tell other scientists, but folks in this room know this far too well. Safety is paramount at every single phase of the process, right? It's not just about the safety of finding the drug and manufacturing the drug, but also the safety eventually in the patient that we must keep paramount. And finally, you can tell by the different colors, there are many different disciplines that come together when we bring a drug all the way from an idea finally to a patient. And it requires a lot of scientists that come from various different backgrounds to come together and work very closely, collaboratively, with input from patients, from doctors, to ultimately make sure that a drug can successfully make it through all those steps in the process. Now, unfortunately, drug development is a process that fails far too often. Only about 10 to 15 of drugs that enter into clinical trials. Now, that is after a lot of work has already been done to get those drugs to a clinical trial in the first place, actually end up making it all the way to approval. I think, as has been alluded to this morning as well, it's also a process that is very lengthy and very costly. It takes us going all the way from idea to drug, about 12 years on average to make it all the way through. There's a lot of variation there too, and it's very expensive. It's remarkable what this program has been able to do with so little money. But that is the exception. That is not the rule. In general, it takes us between $1 to $2 billion per molecule that we are developing. And as you can see here in the percentages that I showed on the bottom, that's how much of that money ends up in the various phases of drug development. And you can see that the vast majority of that investment happens in those blue boxes, those later stages of clinical trials, after a lot of work has already been put into the development of the drug. Now, there's a common theme that comes up in academic drug development, and it's called this valley of death. It's this description that's used to illustrate that there are many promising academic ideas that we have within universities. We publish on them, we share them, but unfortunately, they remain trapped at the university. We never take those ideas further into further development, either in industry or in the clinical space. And so we call that phenomena of promising ideas getting trapped this valley of death. And in the pharmaceutical world, we toss that term quite often, but ultimately, I think it comes down to three main themes. The first one is lack of know-how. Usually in a university space, we are taught science. We're not really taught how to develop drugs. And it turns out that the two are quite different. And it turns out, this was my experience as well, when I left the university and started developing drugs at Genentech, the best way to learn how to develop a drug is to actually roll up your sleeves and do it. And we don't really do it at the university far too often. There's also a cultural misunderstanding. What we are incentivized academics to do well is to publish their finding, to get more grants, more funding to keep doing their research. And it turns out that the experiments that are necessary to do that are not always the experiments that are necessary to provide the robust data that we need to take that idea onto further development into ultimately a drug. And finally, there's an issue of funding. Right? When a discovery is ready to leave the university and hop over the university walls into further development, there's an acute need for funding. And as it turns out, the experiments that are necessary to make that leap successful end up being quite costly. So in the backdrop of all of these challenges, this is where SparkNS comes in. SparkNS starts from what we call the Spark model. It is a model that was developed at Stanford University by my PhD advisor, Daria Moshli-Rosen. And over the past 20 years, it's been developed within the university. It's already been implemented at other universities worldwide with an exceptional success rate. And so what we wanted to do at SparkNS is take the lessons that we've learned building the Spark model of taking promising discoveries into further development outside of the university setting. And what that allows us to do is find the most promising academic discoveries in neuroscience without any regard to where they come from. So we work with investigators from all over the world to take those discoveries and use that same model that we've developed at Stanford to take those discoveries and advance them towards promising therapeutics in the clinic. Now, whenever you start an organization, as we did about 3 years ago, it's important to ask why. And here are my 3 whys as to why we exist. The first one is that the pharmaceutical pipeline, so basically where all of the sources of ideas for drugs come from, depend on academia. More and more often, we have this assumption that those ideas come from the pharmaceutical companies. They don't. They come from usually academic universities. And so if that's the source of ideas, we need to facilitate a way to transition them better. The second one is when we look at complex indications and complex modalities, we need to consider 2 things that primary: the patient and the science. And the more we incubate the patient and the science mentality into our drug development process, the better decisions that we make step by step that keep the patient at the center. And so when we're looking at complex indications, complex modalities, usually areas that the pharmaceutical industry is too risk averse to take on. It's important for us to start beginning generating that data early on in a nonprofit setting so that we can keep our North Star of the patient in science in mind. So in just 3 years, SparkNS has bloomed substantially. And at this point, we have quite a large portfolio. In fact, we have a portfolio that is now the size of most mid to large size biotech companies with a fairly small team. You'll see the team in a second. We have 24 programs. The CTNMB1 program is one of them, one of our strongest, newest programs. We have programs at all phases of drug development, all the way from an initial target that's been identified in a basic research lab, all the way to a phase 2 clinical trial. And that phase 2 clinical trial has started earlier this year in Parkinson's disease. We work across various therapeutic modalities. Gene therapies is one of them, but we also work with small molecules, antibodies. You heard about ASOs. We work on those as well. And we work in Parkinson's disease as well as autism and adjacent neurodevelopmental disorders. So ultimately, what our organization does boils down to 4 main offerings. The first one is funding. That's usually what people think about when they think of SparkNS. But it doesn't stop there. As I mentioned before, developing drugs requires a know-how that we're not traditionally taught at the university. And so what SparkNS has worked really hard to develop is a curriculum in drug development that we're now bringing into the academic space. And what's really exciting, and what I'm excited to share with all of you, is that even though we're bringing these to universities, we're now making these publicly available for free online too. So starting this month, keep a lookout for our work at SparkNS. We're bringing our online learning platform on drug development, where industry experts provide their advice on every phase of drug development to all of you. The next one is around mentorship. We work very closely with our academic investigators and bring them industry experts on the various modalities that we work for. So, for example, gene therapy experts, indication experts, as well as experts from those various phases of drug development. Crucially, though, we have an internal team that helps manage all of this project. So I'm very fortunate to work with an incredible team. Between all of us, we have more than 200 years of experience in drug development. And I don't just say this because I like saying big numbers, but I also say it because every single project that we take on, we truly feel like is a partnership between us and the investigator. And so all of us, our entire team, sits together and evaluates and troubleshoots every single project every single week. We also bring in more than 100 advisors that come to us from industry. I already alluded to these advisors and the importance of getting their feedback on projects. It turns out that there's not just one way to develop a drug, and there's not just one opinion that counts. Nevertheless, failing is something that we cannot afford. We don't have time to fail. And so the more input that we get, we don't try to reach consensus with our advisors. We genuinely try to get all opinions on board and ultimately utilize the expertise that we get in the room to drive the most effective way forward. And finally, what's crucial and what's also evident in this conference as well, it's important to have a community. And so what we've done at SparkNS is establish a robust community that spans both academia and industry. We create a safe, confidential bubble for investigators to share with each other their challenges, their opportunities, their failures, their successes. We have one project that's developing a gene therapy for CTNNB1 syndrome. We have another project that is generating a small molecule for an indication in Parkinson's disease. And there's so much learning that can happen in between. And that is something that we foster through this community. So you're part of a much larger family, and the impact that you're making in your indication is now going to apply to others as well. So I truly mean it when we say it, but our mission is to advance academic discoveries in neuroscience, and we do it together. And so it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And again, thank you so much for having me.